In this lesson, we're going to get started using controllers and return types. The objectives for this lesson are to add product entity and repository classes to help us work with data. We're going to use hard-coded data for now, but we'll use a database later in this course. We're going to get a list of products. We're going to get a single product, and we'll learn about the types of responses that you can send back along with your data. Let's take a look at adding our entity and repository classes. Right mouse click on your project and add a new folder called Entity Layer. Then right mouse click on that folder and add a class called Product. Now into this, we're actually going to put some code that has many properties for a product class. So you can see here we've got a product ID, a name, a product number, a color, a standard cost, a list price, a size, a weight. Many different properties are created inside of here, and these actually map up to a table in an AdventureWorks Lite database that Microsoft has as a sample, and it's the one that we're going to use later in this course. Let's now right mouse click again on the project and add another folder, this one called Repository Layer. And inside of here, we will add an existing item. We're going to go out and search for an item. Now, I've already got that here, so it's called Product Repository. And I'm going to tell you where you can download this in just a second. But this class has two methods in it right now. It has a get method, which will return a collection or a list of product objects. So I'm already hard coding and filling in a bunch of data here. As you can see, lots and lots of data that you can return from this API call here. So lots of stuff there. And then I've got a get where you pass in an ID, which is the product ID, and then we'll find that one in that collection and return it back. So two different methods here. If you want to download this product repository class, you can at this URL. I have a GitHub up there for this particular class, the C# Web API Fundamentals, and it'll also have the customer repository, which you're going to do in the lab. So now let's learn about controllers. A controller is nothing more than a class that provides endpoints or action methods for your APIs. They're the ones that respond to requests made to an MVC website. It can return HTML, JSON, XML, just about anything really. Now, all the controllers you're going to create must inherit from the controller base class that Microsoft provides for us. So let's go ahead and add a controller and let's get all the products from that product repository class. Right mouse click on the controllers folder and add a controller. And when you get the dialog for which type of item you wish to do, let's go ahead and just do the MVC controller-empty. And we will add this. And we'll give it a name. It'll be Product Entity Controller. So always put controller at the end of these names. It is convention, but it works very well. Now let's also then put in some code here. So what I've done is I've added in some usings for the entity layer and the repository layer. We have the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC. We need that in there. And then the namespace it's going to be under is AdventureWorks API.controllers. We then have a route attribute and an API controller attribute. We'll talk about those in a minute. And then we have a public class, product entity controller, that inherits from controller base. All your controllers must inherit from controller base. Now, to create a method that you want to return data and have that exposed as an API, you simply create an action method. I like putting the attribute HTTP GET ahead of it, but that is not 100% necessary. Then we do a public list of product GET. I'm going to create list of product, call it list, a variable called list. Then we're going to get all the data from our product repository by creating a new instance of that product repository and then doing the GET method. And then we'll simply return that list from this method. Let's go ahead and run this. So now you can see that in addition to the weather forecast, I have this other API call now called product entity that is get/API/product entity. So let's talk a minute. How come we have this /API/product entity? If we look at that route attribute. You can see that what I passed in there is a string, and it's API / and then in square brackets controller, which means grab the name of the controller minus the controller part, so product entity. And that is how we get then that URL. So that's our endpoint of how to call this particular API, this method. And when we execute this, it's going to go and grab all that data from that repository. And look at here, here's our response now. So you can see down there's a 200 response code. And then our response body is that array of all of that product data. It's now all expressed as JSON. So we took the C# classes and converts them all to JSON. In our repository class, we also had a method to get a single product. Let's expose that now as an endpoint as well. Let's add a new method to our product entity controller here. Now this new method, HTTP GET as the attribute, but look inside of there. I'm saying I need to have a parameter passed to me. We signify that with the curly braces and then the name of the parameter. We create our public product GET and the parameter int ID. So those two names match up. Now the product is marked as nullable because, hey, when we go out and find it, if they pass an invalid ID, we're not going to get a data back, so we'll get null. Line 25, I create an entity variable of the type product. On line 27, entity equals new product repository, get, passing in the ID, and then we return the entity from this action method. Let's go ahead and run this. We now see our new route here. And you can see it has the curly braces with the ID, which means that it picked up that there is a parameter. So the OpenAPI now gives us a location where we can put in a valid product ID or even an invalid one. Let's go ahead and execute this. And if we've done everything correctly, we should see a response code of 200. And the response body is indeed a valid product ID because there was one that matched 706. Now, what if we put in an invalid ID and we execute that? Now we get 204, which means no content. That's fine, kind of, but really we'd want to get a better status code. Really, a more appropriate one would be 404, not found. So how do we do that? Well, let's find out how to do that next. The return types from each of those action methods has been basically just a C# type. But we really want to avoid using an entity or a list of entities as the return type because those only return a status code of 200 or a 204 if it doesn't find the data. We want flexibility to return other status codes that are more appropriate for calling web APIs. For example, 404, if there's no records in the database table or you can't find the single record requested, we really want to send that back. Or a 500, if our server encountered an error while trying to process the request, that would be another thing that we would want to send back, if the database server's offline or something like that. So what we should be returning is something else. And one of the things that we can return is what's called an IActionResult. This is an interface that represents a web API response where we send the HTTP status code plus the data. To return an IActionResult, we can use one of these built-in methods that are part of the controller base class. For example, return status code, and then the first parameter is the status code number. The second parameter then is the data that you want to send back. So StatusCodes.status200OK is an enumeration that returns that 200 to us. We could also use the OK method, so return OK passing in entity. That also returns a status code of 200 and return new OK object result. All three of these are equivalent. We can also return a status code and use the status enumeration status 404 not found. And you could even optionally pass in a message or something if you wanted. We can also use the not found method, and we can return a new not found object result, and again, passing in a message that we want to return. Let's take a look at returning IActionResult. Let's right mouse click on the controllers folder again and add another controller. This one will be an empty one again. The name for this will be Product IAction Controllers. I'm just giving you some different controllers so we can kind of see these different results and kind of keep them around so you can compare. Now this one, all the using statements are the same as the other. The namespace is the same. The route is the same. The API controller attribute is there, which identifies this controller as having action methods. The public class product IActionController. So product IAction is what's going to get substituted into that route where you see the square bracket controller. It inherits from controller base, of course. I like putting my HTTP GET attribute. Like I said, not exactly necessary, but I like doing it because it's a little more clear of what I'm doing. And now you see the public IActionResult, and it's called GET, this method. So if we take a look at this code, I'm going to create an IActionResult called RET, return, list of products. I'm going to get all the data, and then look what I've done here on line 20, list.clear. So I'm simulating like something went wrong, or just maybe there's no rows in that particular table. And then I'm going to have an if statement. So if list is not equal to null and list.count is greater than 0, let's go ahead and set our return variable to StatusCode, statuscodes.status200 OK, comma, our list. Else, if we did not find anything, ret equals StatusCode, statuscodes.404 not found, no products are available. We then return one of those two. So let's go ahead and try this out. We now see that we have another route now, get API / product IAction. So if we click on this, we try this out and we execute, we're going to get the 404 because we said that's what we want to return when there are no products available. And since we cleared the list, there's no products. Let's go back and comment that line out. Let's run this one more time. And now when we click on this and execute, we're going to get all of that data along with the 200 status code. So we got that before when we just returned the simple list, but you can see that we now have a lot more flexibility on what we return with that. And to be complete, let's go ahead and return a single product using IActionResult. In our product IActionController, let's add another method. And this one, as you can see, has the HTTP GET with that parameter again. So pretty much the same as what we had before, but this time our return type is IActionResult. Again, on line 35, I create an IActionResult, call it RET. I create an entity, which is of the type product. Entity equals new product repository dot get, passing in the ID, and then I can now check to see if the entity coming back is a null. Because I was doing first or default in that get, it will return a null if it doesn't find it. So if it's not equal to null, we found it. Let's go ahead and do our status code with our status200 OK, returning the entity. Otherwise, we did not find it. Let's do our status code with the status 404 not found. And this time I'm actually going to return a nice error message that says, can't find product with a product ID of, and then I'll tell them what the ID was that they were attempting to find. So either one of those status codes are now going to be returned from this action method. Let's go ahead and run this. And now when we run this particular one and we do our 706, for example, we actually get that with our response of 200. But if we put in a bad one, now we're getting kind of more what we're expecting, not just a 204 no content, we're getting a 404 not found, and I get a nice error message that says what I was attempting to find. Now, besides status code, in one of the previous slides there, I said that you could use some of these alternate ways of returning the same thing. Let's just take a look at a few of them very quickly. So here, I could use an OK, and for that, you don't pass in anything. It is a 200, so I can do that. I could also do a new OK object result. Again, I get the same exact result as if I were doing the status code. And for the 404, I can use the not found. And again, I then would not need that status code. And of course, we can do the new not found object result as well. So just some different variations on this. Again, feel free to use whichever one you want. I'm kind of been using this for a long time, so I kind of stick with this one. One thing that's really cool about using the open API is it actually tells you kind of what's coming back, but we can actually augment this a little bit better, and we can add some documentation by using an attribute called produces response type. And we can add status codes for each one that can be returned from our action method. So you can add the status 200 OK, we can add the status 404 not found to our get and our get with the ID, and it'll produce better documentation. So let's take a look at using these produces response type attributes. Before we add these though, let me take a look at what we see right now with the open API. So if we go down here on the get, okay, we see the responses are a code of 200 and a success. That's all we have. So let's go down here and let's add in now produces response type status 200 OK and produces response type status code 404 not found. And we can do that for this one and for this one as well. So if we now run this, now when we open this up, look at that. Now we see a lot more information about what's going to happen. We're going to get a 200 or we're going to get a 404. And we can see that for the other one as well. This is really nice because it now is a little bit more self-documenting. The caller of your API will now know the status codes to expect from calling your API. An even better return type is ActionResult. This is a generic, and it's recommended you use this because now what we can do is we can put in the actual type that we're going to return. So now what happens is ASP.NET can generate example JSON from the type that's specified for Swagger, for your open API. So consumers of your API can read this metadata and they know exactly what they're going to get back. They'll see the JSON structure of a product object or a list of products, and that's going to help reduce the need for you to write formal documentation. Let's take a look at using the ActionResult generic. Once again, let's right mouse click on controllers and let's add a controller, or if you want, you can just add a class. And then you give it a name like product controller, because if you know what you're doing, you can just replace all the code. And I've already got my sample here already done. So I'm going to go ahead and just add this. So now what I've done is I've got my product controller. It inherits from controller base. So everything else being the same. We have the HTTP GET, we have our produces response types. We also now, on each of the GET and the GET with the ID being passed down, I have changed this now to be an action result. I'm saying it could be an IEnumerable of products, so it could be a list, it could be something else. Could also be down here on line 32, I'm going to get it back an action result of a product. So that's the only change I made. All the rest of the code is exactly the same. But let's now run this. We'll now have this new API endpoint that we can look at. So now when we look at this, look at the documentation we get. We get a 200 with a success, and look at the JSON, some example JSON that they're putting in there. Isn't that nice? And then we have the 404. And then for the GET, same thing. We have the 200. It shows us what this schema is going to be returning. So highly recommend you use the ActionResult generic here. In this lesson, we learned the many different ways that you can return responses from API calls. We should always use the produces response type attribute. Helps us with the documentation. Our API callers know what to expect as far as status codes coming back. And always use the ActionResult T as your return type. So again, the callers can see the actual schema that's going to be returned. Coming up next, how routing works.